If you called your parents for help and they listened to you disappear in real time, what would remain after the line went silent? That question has haunted one American family for more than a decade, echoing through phone records, police reports, and an empty stretch of rural Minnesota that refuses to give answers. Tonight's story is not about screams, violence, or a visible crime scene. It is about an unsolved mystery, a cold case defined by absence rather than evidence. A single phone call that lasted 47 minutes, long enough for hope to exist, but short enough for terror to arrive uninvited. Beneath the quiet farmland of Minnesota lies a dark past that does not announce itself with blood, but with silence. This is the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, a 19-year-old college student who did everything right, trusted his instincts, called home for help, and still vanished. Not suddenly, not violently, but slowly, step by step, while his parents were listening. Minnesota at night does not feel threatening, especially to those who grew up inside its rhythm. The roads stretch long and flat, cutting through farmland that looks endless in daylight and indistinguishable after dark. Cornfields line both sides, their dry leaves whispering when the wind moves through them, creating a sound that feels alive but offers no direction. Drainage ditches carve shallow lines into the land, carrying runoff water away from fields that depend on them to survive. They are functional, ordinary, and rarely noticed. Headlights carve narrow tunnels through the darkness, and beyond that thin cone of visibility, the world simply disappears. These are not places people fear. These are places people trust. Rural America has a particular kind of danger, one that rarely announces itself with urgency. It does not arrive with alarms, crowds, or visible threats. Instead, it hides behind familiarity and repetition. The same roads are driven every day. The same landmarks are passed without thought. The belief slowly forms that nothing bad ever happens where nothing ever changes. In small towns, safety becomes an assumption rather than a question. And psychologically, assumptions are dangerous because they lower vigilance without our awareness. Sometimes, that assumption becomes the first and only mistake. Brandon Swanson grew up inside that sense of quiet certainty. At 19 years old, he was a freshman at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, studying wind energy technology. His academic choice reflected practicality rather than ambition. He was not chasing prestige or attention. He was building a future close to home, in a field connected to the land he knew. Friends and family consistently described Brandon as polite, soft-spoken, and reliable. He was not reckless, not impulsive, and not searching for trouble. By every available account gathered by investigators and journalists after his disappearance, Brandon lived within boundaries. Psychologically, Brandon represented stability. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no known conflicts, and no pattern of risky behavior. His routines were predictable. He attended classes, spent time with friends, and returned home frequently. His identity was anchored in reassurance and structure. When something went wrong, Brandon did not hide it. It called home. That habit matters more than it first appears, because it reveals where Brandon believed safety truly lived. Not in his own judgment alone, not in authority figures, but in the presence of his parents' voices on the other end of the line. At the time of his disappearance, Brandon was standing at a psychological crossroads familiar to many young adults. He was transitioning into independence while still relying on emotional anchors. Developmentally, this period is marked by confidence layered over inexperience. The brain feels capable, but its risk assessment systems are still calibrating. Brandon had begun college, tasted freedom, and navigated social spaces without severing family ties. This balance is significant. He trusted himself enough to drive home late at night, but trusted his parents enough to ask for help when uncertainty appeared. Brian and Annette Swanson were not distant or detached figures. They were actively present, emotionally available, and deeply involved in their son's life. There was no history of family conflict, no reports of tension, no hidden resentments uncovered by investigators. They were described as attentive parents who maintained regular communication with Brandon. In true crime narratives, families often carry secrets that complicate investigations. In this case, the absence of dysfunction became part of the mystery. There was no obvious fracture where suspicion could settle. Marshall, Minnesota, where the Swansons lived, reflected the same quiet normalcy. It is a small town in southwestern Minnesota. With a population just over 13,000, people recognize faces. Emergencies are rare enough to be memorable. Crime rates are low. For residents, danger feels abstract, something that happens elsewhere. But the surrounding landscape tells a different story. Beyond town limits, rural terrain grows unpredictable. Gravel roads branch without signage. Some roads end at isolated farmhouses, while others dissolve into emptiness. Drainage ditches deepen without warning, particularly after heavy rainfall. Rivers shift constantly, narrowing, widening, or vanishing beneath dense vegetation. Their course is reshaped by seasonal floods, erosion, and time. This environment demands local knowledge. Without it, navigation becomes guesswork. And guesswork, when paired with darkness, fatigue, and stress, can quietly become lethal. Many of the waterways in southwestern Minnesota are not marked on standard road maps. Some appear dry during certain months and swell rapidly after storms. At night, depth perception collapses. A shallow slope can hide a sudden drop. The town itself may be small, but the land surrounding it is vast and indifferent. Familiarity ends where the pavement does. On the surface, Brandon Swanson's life showed no warning signs. There were no red flags, no troubling behaviors, no indications that he was heading toward danger. But psychologically, danger rarely arrives through disruption. It arrives through overconfidence in normality. It arrives through the belief that help is always close, that the road will always lead somewhere known, and that a phone call is enough to bridge any distance. These beliefs are not foolish. They are human. On the night Brandon disappeared, nothing about his life suggested it would end in silence. He did not leave home in anger. He did not vanish while fleeing conflict. He did not cut ties or abandon plans. He followed the same logic that had guided him safely through every previous inconvenience. That is precisely why what happened next feels so unsettling. Because if someone like Brandon can disappear while doing everything right, then safety is not as predictable as we want to believe. And in that realization, the foundation of this story quietly destabilizes. What once felt predictable begins to feel fragile. The routines that protected Brandon no longer offer certainty, and the landscape that seemed familiar turns subtly hostile. When safety collapses without warning, it forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it waits patiently, hidden beneath the assumptions we trust most. On May 13, 2008, Brandon Swanson attended a small gathering with friends near Canby, Minnesota. It was not a party defined by chaos or excess. According to witness statements, later reviewed by investigators, there were no heated arguments, no emotional confrontations, and no indication that Brandon felt unsafe or distressed. The atmosphere was casual, familiar, and uneventful. Shortly after midnight, Brandon decided to leave and drive home alone, a choice that did not raise concern among those who saw him go. In hindsight, that decision has been dissected repeatedly. But from a psychological standpoint, it aligns precisely with Brandon's known personality. He believed himself to be capable, alert, and in control of his actions. Toxicology reports were never produced because Brandon was never recovered alive, but witness accounts consistently stated that he did not appear heavily intoxicated. More importantly, Brandon himself did not believe he was impaired or endangered. The human brain does not activate its survival alarms unless it perceives an immediate threat. At that moment, Brandon perceived none. Sometime around 1:15 a.m., Brandon's vehicle became stuck in a ditch along a gravel road. This was not unusual for rural Minnesota, where unmarked roads often blend seamlessly into farmland and drainage areas. Brandon believed he was near the town of Lind, approximately 10 miles from his parents' home in Marshall. This belief would later be proven incorrect by more than 25 miles. However, at the time, that assumption shaped every decision that followed. In his mind, he was not lost. He was delayed. This distinction matters psychologically. People who believe they are lost behave differently than those who believe they are merely inconvenienced. Brandon did not conserve energy or wait in place. He did not activate emergency thinking. He believed help was nearby, accessible, and within reach. That belief gave him confidence, but it also removed caution. Brandon did not call the police. This decision has been widely scrutinized, yet it is consistent with documented behavior patterns among young adults in similar situations. Brandon feared receiving a citation for drinking and driving, even if he was below legal impairment. This fear reflects a moral framework where law enforcement is associated with punishment rather than assistance. From his perspective, calling home felt safer, more reasonable, and less consequential. In that moment, it was the choice that preserved control. The phone call connected Brandon to familiarity. His parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, answered immediately. The tone of the conversation was calm and practical. Brandon explained that his car was stuck and that he believed he knew where he was. He described seeing lights in the distance and planned to walk toward them. Brian and Annette got into their vehicle and began driving to find him, keeping Brandon on the line to maintain contact and orientation. For the next 47 minutes, Brandon remained on the phone. This detail is one of the most documented aspects of the case. Phone records confirmed the call duration, and Brian and Annette later recounted its content in multiple interviews. During this time, Brandon walked through darkness, describing fences, gravel roads, and the sound of running water. He believed these details would help his parents locate him. Instead, they revealed a growing disconnect. Brian and Annette attempted to triangulate Brandon's position based on his descriptions. They drove the roads near Lind, stopping periodically to listen. They honked the car horn, expecting Brandon to hear it. He did not. This mismatch grew increasingly concerning. Brandon's descriptions did not align with their surroundings. Landmarks he mentioned did not exist where he believed he was. Yet Brandon remained confident in his orientation. This discrepancy is critical from a cognitive perspective. Under stress, the brain constructs internal spatial maps that feel accurate but can be profoundly incorrect. Darkness removes visual anchors. Fatigue dulls executive function. Even mild alcohol consumption, well below intoxication, can distort depth perception and directional awareness. Together, these factors can convince a person that movement equals progress, even when it leads away from safety. Throughout the call, Brandon did not express panic. He did not raise his voice or indicate fear. He did not ask his parents to hurry or express concern that something was wrong. He remained composed and conversational. This calmness may have delayed his parents' sense of urgency. Humans are conditioned to associate danger with distress signals. Calm voices do not trigger alarm, even when danger is approaching silently. Near the end of the call, Brandon mentioned hearing running water, a detail that would later define the search. Southwestern Minnesota is threaded with unmarked ditches and creeks whose depths shift with rainfall. At night, moving water distorts perception. Sound travels unpredictably. Moments later, Brandon uttered a brief realization. Then the call ended, leaving only silence. There was no crash, no prolonged noise, no audible struggle. The call ended abruptly, as if something interrupted it, rather than gradually overtaking it. Brian and Annette attempted to call Brandon back repeatedly. According to phone records and their later statements, the phone rang multiple times. The calls connected, but no one answered. This suggests that the phone remained powered on and intact for some period after the call ended. From a psychological perspective, Brandon's final words are significant. They imply sudden recognition rather than mounting fear. He did not cry out for help. He did not plead. He acknowledged a mistake. This suggests an instantaneous awareness of danger, not panic, but realization. Something changed in his environment without warning. Something he did not anticipate entered his awareness, and before he could adapt, the connection was lost. In missing person cases, last words often reveal mental state more clearly than physical evidence. Brandon did not say help. He did not say stop. He did not name a threat. He recognized an error. That distinction shifts the interpretation of what followed. It suggests that Brandon was not fleeing from someone else. He was confronting the consequences of misperception. What followed remains unknown, but what came before reveals ordinary decisions, shaped by misperception, quietly leading into an unforgiving and irreversible silence. When Brandon did not return home by morning, Brian and Annette Swanson contacted local authorities. What began as a concerned family report quickly escalated into a coordinated search operation. Law enforcement agencies from multiple counties became involved. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers joined officers, combing through farmland, gravel roads, drainage ditches and waterways. Search dogs were deployed to follow scent trails. Sonar equipment was used to scan submerged areas. Divers entered rivers and deep ditches, where visibility was low and conditions unpredictable. At first, the search focused heavily on the area near Lind, the town Brandon believed he was closest to during the phone call. This decision made sense based on the information available at the time. Investigators relied on the last known verbal location provided by the missing person himself. In most cases, that information is reliable. In this one, it was not. Brandon's car was eventually located near Porter, Minnesota, more than 25 miles from where he thought he was. This discovery fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation. It meant that Brandon had been profoundly mistaken about his location for the entire duration of the 47-minute phone call. Every assumption built on his descriptions collapsed at once. The search area had been wrong. The mental map guiding both Brandon and his parents had been incorrect. The car itself offered little clarity. It was found stuck in a ditch along a rural road, consistent with Brandon's account. There were no signs of a collision severe enough to cause injury. No broken glass, no deployed airbags, and no blood. There was no evidence of a struggle, no indication that another vehicle had been involved, and no sign that another person had been present. The scene appeared quiet, ordinary, and disturbingly uneventful, yet the environment surrounding the car was deceptive. Tall grass obscured deep drainage channels. Mud along the ditch was soft and unstable, capable of pulling weight downward without resistance. In several areas, water depth changed abruptly within a few feet. Investigators later noted that a person could easily step into what appeared to be shallow ground and suddenly lose footing. In daylight, these hazards were visible. At night, they were nearly invisible. Because the search initially focused on the wrong location, valuable time was lost. In rural environments, time is not neutral. Weather alters terrain quickly. Rain raises water levels and accelerates currents. Wind erases footprints. Scent trails degrade rapidly, especially near water. By the time search efforts shifted to the area near Porter, days had passed. Whatever physical evidence may have existed immediately after Brandon vanished had likely been compromised. As the search widened, media attention surged. Brandon became known as the boy who vanished on the phone, a label that reduced a complex case to a haunting phrase. National coverage followed, and online speculation grew. Some criticized law enforcement, others questioned family decisions, while a few insisted on foul play without supporting evidence. For the Swanson family, grief was compounded by scrutiny. They were asked to defend decisions made under stress, in the middle of the night, with incomplete information. Psychologically, this is a common secondary trauma in high-profile missing person cases. When answers are absent, suspicion rushes to fill the vacuum. The human mind struggles with uncertainty. It prefers blame, even unfounded blame, over silence. Investigators explored multiple theories. The most widely supported involved accidental drowning. Brandon may have fallen into a drainage ditch or creek while walking in darkness. Many of these waterways connect to the Yellow Medicine River, a system known for fluctuating depths and strong currents during certain seasons. Seasonal flooding could have moved, remains far from the point of entry, dispersing physical evidence beyond immediate search zones. This theory aligned with environmental risk, Brandon's disorientation, and the absence of violence indicators. Another theory proposed that Brandon encountered a third party. This possibility was investigated, but no evidence supported it. There were no witnesses who reported seeing Brandon after the phone call ended. No suspicious vehicles were identified. No motive emerged. Random acts of violence in that rural area were statistically rare, and no pattern of similar incidents existed. Without indicators such as trauma, defensive wounds, or conflicting timelines, this theory remained speculative. A third theory centered on complete disorientation and exposure. Brandon may have wandered for hours, exhausting himself physically and mentally. Minnesota nights can become cold even in late spring. Hypothermia does not require freezing temperatures. Fatigue impairs judgment, slows reaction time, and increases the likelihood of falls. In such cases, the body often shuts down quietly, without dramatic struggle. This theory emphasized physiology over malice. In August 2009, more than a year after Brandon's disappearance, human remains were discovered in the Yellow Medicine River near Porter. The location was downstream from where his car had been found. DNA analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Brandon Swanson. Due to decomposition and environmental exposure, medical examiners could not determine a cause of death. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no fractures consistent with assault, and no evidence that could definitively confirm drowning. The river had erased much of the story Brandon's body once carried. Water is both a witness and an eraser. it preserves nothing for long. Investigators concluded that while foul play could not be entirely ruled out, there was no evidence to support it. No charges were filed, no suspect was named. The case was officially closed as an accidental death, though many questions remained unanswered. From an investigative perspective, the outcome remains deeply unsatisfying. There was no defining breakthrough, no complete reconstruction of events, and no evidence strong enough to establish certainty. The case concluded not with facts, but with probabilities. For the public and for Brandon's family, this absence of resolution became its own burden. Silence replaced explanation. There was no villain to confront, no singular error to correct. In true crime, closure often comes from understanding intent, but here, intent never existed. What remains is the unsettling truth that a life can vanish without malice, conflict, or clear cause, leaving silence as the final answer. Fear is often imagined as something loud and chaotic, but in reality, it is frequently quiet, methodical, and deeply internal. From a psychological perspective, Brandon Swanson's final known actions do not reflect panic in the dramatic sense. They reflect a brain under stress, attempting to survive. The fight-or-flight response does not always result in running or screaming. Sometimes it results in continued movement, rigid focus, and an unshakable belief that the next step will be safer than stopping. When the human brain perceives threat, it narrows its attention. This narrowing is meant to protect, but it also distorts. Spatial awareness collapses, direction becomes unreliable, distance is misjudged. In darkness, without visual anchors, the mind substitutes confidence for accuracy. Brandon did not flee from a person or an attacker. He did not react to violence. He reacted to uncertainty. His behavior suggests not fear of something chasing him, but fear of being stranded, immobile, and alone. Cognitive psychology shows that under stress, humans prefer action over stillness. Movement creates the illusion of control. Standing still feels like surrender. Brandon's decision to walk, to keep talking, to narrate his surroundings, was an attempt to maintain agency. He believed that survival depended on progress. In that sense, his actions were rational. He was not running away. He was moving toward what he believed was safety. This misalignment between perception and reality is central to understanding what happened. Brandon's brain constructed a map based on incomplete data. Darkness removed visual correction. Fatigue reduced executive oversight. Mild alcohol consumption, even below legal impairment, may have further impaired spatial judgment. None of these factors alone are fatal. Together, they can quietly overwhelm cognition. The result is not terror, but confidence in the wrong direction. From a philosophical lens, this case aligns closely with Buddhist thought, particularly the concept of avideb, or ignorance. In Buddhism, ignorance is not a failure of intelligence or awareness, but a fundamental misunderstanding of reality as it truly is. Suffering does not arise because the world is inherently cruel or hostile, but because the mind interprets it incorrectly. Brandon did not suffer simply because the night was dark or the landscape was harsh. He suffered because his perception of his surroundings no longer matched reality. The danger was not the darkness itself, but the confidence he placed in an inaccurate mental map. Darkness only became lethal when paired with In this sense, the tragedy reflects a timeless truth. When awareness fails to align with reality, even familiar environments can quietly turn unforgiving. Humans do not fear darkness itself. Darkness is neutral. What we fear is disorientation within it. The inability to locate oneself produces existential anxiety. It strips away certainty. In Brandon's case, that fear was subtle. It did not explode into panic. It expressed itself as persistence, as walking, as believing that the next landmark would make sense. Christian theology offers another lens. Brandon's phone call was, in many ways, a prayer, not to God, but to his parents. He reached out in trust, expecting response, guidance, and rescue. For 47 minutes, that prayer was answered. Voices reassured him. Then, abruptly, it was not. The silence that followed mirrors one of the most difficult spiritual questions in Christian tradition. What does silence mean when help is expected? In religious narratives, silence is often framed as a test of faith, not punishment, but absence. In Brandon's case, the silence was literal and final. His last moment of awareness was followed not by explanation, but by quiet. For those left behind, especially his parents, that silence carried unbearable weight. It offered no meaning, no closure, and no reassurance that help arrived in time. Confucian philosophy emphasizes relational responsibility and trust in social order. Brandon acted entirely within that framework. He did not isolate himself. He sought guidance. He trusted elders. He believed connection equaled protection. From this view, his actions were morally correct. The tragedy lies not in his choices, but in the limits of human systems when confronted by nature's indifference. From an investigative standpoint, modern analysis continues to focus on hydrology. Rivers and drainage systems are not static. Seasonal water levels rise and fall. Currents shift with rainfall. Debris alters flow paths. In the Yellow Medicine River watershed, a body can travel significant distances over time, especially during spring runoff. This explains why Brandon's remains were found far from his vehicle, and why early searches may have missed critical areas. Newer investigative models emphasize environmental reconstruction rather than criminal profiling. Instead of asking who harmed Brandon, they ask how water moved that season, how soil behaved after rainfall, and how visibility would have appeared at ground level in complete darkness. These approaches do not provide certainty, but they reduce the need for imagined violence. Still, one question lingers, cutting through psychology, philosophy, and science. If Brandon had not spoken those final words, would this case have endured? If the call had ended quietly, without realization, without interruption, would his disappearance have faded into statistics? Or is it that single moment of awareness, captured by chance, that forces us to confront our own vulnerability? We remember Brandon not because of how he lived, but because of how his presence dissolved in real time. His fear did not manifest as terror, but as effort. His final companion was not an attacker, but uncertainty. And perhaps that is what makes this story so enduring. It does not warn us about evil, it warns us about being human. If Brandon had not spoken in that final instant, if there had been no acknowledgement of error, no verbal recognition that something had gone wrong, would this story still exist in our collective memory? Would his disappearance have blended quietly into statistics and forgotten case files? Perhaps memory itself is not born from events, but from awareness. From the moment fear surfaces and names itself. In Brandon's case, it was not the fall, the water, or the darkness that echoed. It was the instant his mind realized it no longer understood the world around him. There was no killer waiting in the dark, no confession, no courtroom resolution, only a phone call that never truly ended, replayed in memory rather than sound. Brandon Swanson's disappearance reminds us that danger does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives disguised as confidence, familiarity, and the belief that help is close enough to hear. If fear is a mirror, it reflects not monsters, but misunderstanding. Darkness becomes lethal when it meets assumption. Technology offers connection, but not protection. And silence, once it begins, does not explain itself. Do not underestimate night landscapes you believe you know. Do not assume orientation without certainty. And never believe that a voice on the line can replace physical safety. If this story stayed with you, please like, share the video, and subscribe for more true crime stories. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Minds.